Well, as you know, today we'll talk about BOK's regular monetary policy meeting. It's about a week away. Do you think Bank of Korea will hold the policy rate or cut the rate further?
So we think that the Bank of Korea is going to hold the policy rates. That's mainly because it's reaching the limits of conventional policy. The policy rate is at 0.5%. So there's a limit to how much further rate cuts can boost the economy. What we might see, though, is more announcements of unconventional methods to try and boost demand. The bank has already announced that it will buy government bonds to try and control long-term government bond yields, but they may announce something more explicit, such as regular purchases of government bonds or indeed a long-term yield target.
So when you mean like they're going to come up with a long-term yield target, you mean like it's a kind of a yield curve control like Japan, right?
Exactly, yes. So at the moment, there's the spread between a 1-year government bond and a 10-year government bond is around 100 basis points or so. So what they could do is announce a yield target for, say, 10-year government bonds, and that would flatten the curve and push down long-term bond yields.
You said that's because it's like they cannot, like the Bank of Korea cannot cut the rate. So that's because it's like they think there will be a side effect of cutting the rate, right?
Yes, well, the bank has discussed this before, but it's never really given a clear estimate of what it thinks, what it terms the effective lower bound, the point at which rate cuts cease to have the desired effect. But at 0.5%, it looks likely that the bank is at or close to that point.
So I think there must be a side effect of cutting the rate right now, so they cannot cut it. But also isn't there any side effect of yield curve control?
I mean, lowering long-term rates, there's always a trade-off in any kind of policy move. And for instance, the bank is worried about the housing market at the moment. And if you lower rates further, and especially over the long term, then mortgages become cheaper and more affordable, and that might fuel the housing market. But what the bank has to do at the moment is look at the balance of risks and balance the risk of maybe overinflating the housing market a little bit against the risk of that the pandemic poses to demand. And obviously, up to this point, it's taken the judgment that supporting the economy through the pandemic is the more important thing, and I suspect that it will continue to do that. Using monetary policy is kind of a blunt instrument if you want to target a small sector of the economy, such as the housing market. Macroprudential policy, the bank and the government can move in. I mean, they've already tried lots of different measures to try and cool the housing market. They've had limited effects so far, but it's how much they've tapered off the rally. But I suspect that the government and the bank will try and go further down that route rather than adjusting monetary policy to account for the housing market.
So when we're talking about the asset classes, you think that government should act more actively than the Bank of Korea?
Yes, I think the government has more tools, and the bank too, but headline monetary policy, such as adjusting the policy rate or buying government bonds, isn't really the right tool to address the housing market.
Okay, then let's talk about Korean real estate market. Well, that's for Korean government, it seems like it's a really hot potato. They think too much money is flowing into the real estate. But some people say that that's not only the Koreans' problem too. So how do you think, what do you think about Korean real estate market?
Well, it's obviously, we've seen a big jump in prices, especially in the popular areas of Seoul. And it's concerning for the government because politically, high housing costs are not popular, obviously, because it makes it harder for people to get onto the property ladder. So it is politically it's hard, but for the bank, for Bank of Korea, they've said it's important in the past, but it should, like I said before, remain lower down the list of priorities than supporting the economy at this time.
Then also, like when we are talking about the real estate market, another asset price that like many Korean people are looking at is the stock market. Like last week, like stock market, like South Korean stock market shows like one of the world's hottest rallies. Like people who don't know much about like economy think that stock market should also move in tandem with the economy itself, right? But like as everybody know, economy is not fully recovered because of the pandemic, but stock market is skyrocketing. Why do you think the reason why?
Actually, a bit of a misconception that the stock market reflects the economy entirely. First of all, it's dominated by big technology companies such as Samsung. And also Samsung earns most of its revenues abroad. So its stock price and expectations of future earnings of the companies that are on Korea's stock market more depends on the global economy and sentiment about their earnings potential than it does about the domestic economy. So the rally we've seen has really been driven by investors, both domestic and foreign, hoping to gain a foothold in technology companies that are doing well out of a big surge in demand for tech products such as semiconductors. So it really isn't much of a reflection on the domestic economy. It doesn't really signal a disconnect between the stock market and what's happening at home.
Then, like, is there any side effect of this kind of like thing? Like, because like it's not moving together, as you said, it's just like expectation of the people that tech companies will gonna earn a lot later on. So, is there any side effect of this kind of booming stock market right now?
Well, the only side effect really would be is if this was been driven by a really speculative bubble, and if it were to crash later on. We don't think that we're sort of in that territory yet. If you look at the valuations of Korean equities, they're nowhere near where they were during, say, the tech bubble in 2000, 2001. What we think is happening is being driven by fundamentals of the global economy and of rising demand for semiconductors and other such products.
A U.S. election is like only a few months away, and U.S. market is already focused on like November election. So like, if Joe Biden wins, like how will it affect like global market and monetary policy, including Korea? And also, what if Trump wins?
Yes, so our US team at Capital Economics actually wrote a really good piece on this recently. I mean, the big difference between the two candidates really is in taxing and spending. So while both look to be fairly loose on the fiscal policy side, Joe Biden has promised a big increase in tax revenue raising, and that's mainly going to be focused on corporates and high earners. So in terms of its implications for the stock market, it's probably not going to be great for stock market in the US. I mean, that's not to say it's not a good thing in general or to pass judgment, but it's likely not to fuel a further rally in the stock market. Yeah. But I think the overall conclusion of our US team is that no matter who wins, monetary policy is necessarily going to have to remain really loose in the US because it's still going to be recovering from the massive economic slump caused by the global pandemic. And as such, it's not really going to have, the election is not going to have a huge impact on the economy, certainly not going to change its path.
With the US, let's also talk about Sino-US relations. Like Sino-US relations are at their lowest point in decades, and it can be heated until US election. So do you think South Korea will be the casualty of the escalating US-China tension, and how it can be affected?
Yeah, so obviously relations have deteriorated a lot during the Trump administration. It doesn't necessarily, in fact, it's unlikely that relations will be reset even if, as seems likely, Joe Biden wins the election. Trump has really shifted American thinking on this. So while there might be a thawing of a relationship, it looks like trade tensions are going to drag on. Now, what we've actually seen from the trade war over the past couple of years is that while countries like Korea that supply a lot of intermediate goods to China, which are then made to finished products and shipped to the US, have seen a drop in demand, but that demand has been made up by a shift in supply chains. So, for instance, US firms buying directly from Korea rather than China due to increased tariffs. And really, that offset has been quite big, which meant that the overall impact of the trade war has not been a game changer for countries like Korea. And that's kind of what we expect to happen going forward. That the trade war will be disruptive, but supply chains have proved themselves to be very flexible in the region, and for the most part, it's not going to be a complete game changer for regional economies.
What are your Korean policy rate forecasts for 2020? And also tell me about your growth and inflation forecast for this year. Is there anything different from your previous call?
Yeah, so firstly, our growth forecast, we previously expected the Korean economy to shrink by 1.5% this year, with risk to the upside actually that it might be a little bit less than that. But given the past week and the so-called second wave of infections, we've actually trimmed our growth forecast, and we now expect the economy to shrink by 2% this year. Oh. That's because the rebound in consumption that we saw in the second quarter, we think that's really going to tail off because of restrictions brought in by the government and just people changing their economic behavior, and that's going to delay their recovery somewhat in Korea. I mean, that would still place Korea among some of the top performing economies in the region. Only really Taiwan, China, and Vietnam would have better growth rates. The bank is likely to keep interest rates very low for the foreseeable future, so we expect it to keep the base rate at 0.5% this year and next. And we wouldn't be surprised if it were to commit to some more firm asset purchases, such as maybe an explicit yield target, in order to try and push down long-term bond yields and support economic growth. It will be allowed to do that by low inflation. We've only got inflation of 0.3% year on year penciled in for this year, and about 0.5 to 1% next year.
You said consumption was okay last quarter, but it won't be able to be like that this quarter. Many people were thinking is the last quarter consumption because of the government money? Do you think Korea have to do that once again if the growth rate is going down like that?
Well, the first point to make is that while consumption rebounded from the first quarter, it was still well below pre-crisis levels. So we saw something like a over 6% Q&Q drop in Q1, in Q2. So it still has a long way to go to recover. And we just think that recovery is going to be stalled somewhat by a surge in cases recently. And government support has most likely helped consumption to rebound. But the problem is if you put money in people's pockets, but they still don't go out and spend it because they're scared of catching the virus or there's restrictions in place, then there's limits to what that extra spending can do to boost the economy. We may see more of a jumping spending in, say, the fourth quarter as people are sat on a pile of money that they haven't been able to spend due to restrictions or the virus outbreak.
Thank you so much for sharing your valuable insight with us.